I think what President Netanyahu wants is a guarantee of continued delivery of all the ordnance and military equipment that he needs, whether it comes in the form of F-35 jets or missiles, rockets, anything. And I think he will certainly get that. As you know, President Trump has just announced $1 billion worth of equipment on its way to Israel. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think there will be a discussion about what's happening in the region. And that's going to be difficult because President Trump is not comfortable with what's happening in Gaza. Remember, he said, I want you to get it over with. Now, you and I regard that as a rather callous remark, given that we're talking about the lives and property of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, that hasn't happened. And what he's gotten is instead a truce. And I think there'll be some discussion about pressing ahead to, quote unquote, finish the job in Gaza, whatever that means. And then there's the second part of this. But what are we going to do to help the Israelis secure their northern border now with Syria? They've moved into Syria. They want to retain territory in southern Syria. Are we going to stand by that and allow them to acquire that and keep it? And that puts us at odds potentially with the Turks. Then the other issue is the Kurdish problem in Syria. There are large numbers of Kurds, thousands that are ready to fight against the Turks if the Turks decide to remove them. There's a lot of evidence that that's actually beginning now. Are we going to pull all our forces out or not? You'll recall that in the past, President Trump has said, I want those forces out, and then ultimately he backed down. A friend of mine in the Navy who is an expert in missiles and travels all over, where he's just recently returned from the Pacific, told me, he said, if a war lasts longer than 2 weeks, we run out of all conventional munitions. At that point, we have to go nuclear. Well, that's absurd. We don't ever want to go nuclear.
Right.
We're in a very serious condition right now, and our armed forces do not need to be rebuilt. We need to build new armed forces. The world has changed. Warfare has changed. This business of rebuilding the old plant all over again is the wrong way to go. The intelligent thing for the president to do right now is to say, we've got to disengage and retrench. We're going to run out of money. We're on the verge of a fiscal crisis, something we've never seen, certainly not since the Depression. I don't know how we come out of it. But the bottom line is we don't have the resources, we don't have the forces to do this in perpetuity. And that's effectively what we're signed up to do. And then someone in the back of the room will say, well, what about country X or country Y? What about the border? How many thousands of troops is it going to take us to really secure the border? And when we do, and we cut off the drug cartels from their enormous profits from human trafficking as well as drug trafficking, we're going to have a war on our hands. I think we have a war there now. Why are we not focusing on those things? And he knows that. I know President Trump, and I know he's concerned with those things. So this has all got to go away. He's got to stand up and say, look, I love Israel. I love the people. I want to help them in any way I can. But I cannot join their war in perpetuity. I cannot make their enemies America's enemies. This is not a relationship that we should want to have. Small states always have an interest in dragging a large power into their region to do their bidding. That's what we are right now. We're the suckers who've been drawn in to do the bidding of the Israeli. We've been in this business now for almost 30 years, off and on. It's failed miserably everywhere. This would be, a road to certain ruin for us. And very shortly, Americans would look around and they would say, what are we doing here? This is what I try to tell people so often. Soldiers, Marines, they're not stupid people. They arrive at a place like this in Gaza. They look around and they say, what the hell are we doing here? We're not going to be able to change anything here. These people don't want us. They're going to shoot at us eventually, regardless of what happens. And they all understood that. But the generals and the politicians insisted, oh, no, we're bringing them this and that liberal democracy or whatever other benefits there are. The people in Gaza are not interested in living in luxury condos overlooking the ocean. I'm sure if you built them for them, they would probably consider it seriously. Right now, they just want to go home. And look at the photographs, the masses of human beings marching north back into areas where they used to live, where there is, as Secretary Rubio pointed out, nothing for them. Well, it looks like he recognizes who the real boss in charge is, and that's obviously Netanyahu. This is a shameful display of subservience that is completely inconsistent with the interests of the United States and the American people. You know, it's hard to fathom how we got here. But let's be frank. The president would not now be in the White House were it not for the enormous quantities of money that were poured into his campaign by donors who are enthusiastic Zionists,
right?
Wealthy Jews. We understand that. But he's still the president of the United States. Hegseth is probably on the ragged edge of getting himself into very serious trouble. He needs to look at the limitations of our assets and our resources. It's this callous disregard for the lives of human beings. However much you want to support Israel, you know, we as Americans are not interested in the destruction of human life in Gaza. That's not something that we all agreed to do. It's something that should be judged as reprehensible. The idea that we will take this over and rebuild everything sounds wonderful until you get to the question of what happens to the population that lives there. And the underlying truth is that President Trump and Netanyahu are both agreed that these people will be forcibly removed. To where? Under what circumstances? Hopefully now that you've gotten this dramatic response out of the whole Islamic world, and not just there, but also President Xi in China, now President Putin in Moscow, everyone has said this is unacceptable. We wouldn't support this anywhere in the world. And as I keep telling people over and over and over again, you know, I like Israel. I supported the state and support helping Israel defend itself. But I didn't sign on for this project that is now involving expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands, million people. It's incomprehensible. It's un-American. But there's no sense of that right now. And I think he must be operating in an echo chamber. Somebody has got to step inside and tell him, look, this is not what we are about. This is not what we as Americans support. Why are we doing this? The previous presidents have always been very careful to set limits, you know, establish these things that the diplomats like to call guardrails these days.
Right.
They did that from Eisenhower on. All of a sudden now they're gone, and we're doing the bidding of Mr. Netanyahu and his agents and backers in the United States and around the world. It's not a good picture for the United States. It's bad for President Trump. The other thing is that if he had been serious about this and his staff was doing their jobs, if the NSA was advising him, and for that matter, the Secretary of State, they would have all weighed in and said, Mr. President, let us talk to the people in the region. What do the people in Cairo think? What do the people in Riyadh think? What do the people in Ankara think? I mean, all of these people have a stake in what happens in Palestine. And to sort of say, well, everybody I've talked to thinks it's a great idea, and he finds out overnight, immediately, everyone else says, absolutely not. It's horrific. He's now not just complicit, he seems to be trying to extend this wholesale ethnic cleansing operation, mass deportation or mass murder operation in Gaza as far as possible. And then he tells everyone, well, you know, once we've done this and we've rebuilt this place and it looks like Las Vegas on the Med, anybody can come and live there. Well, that's like saying we're gonna roll over everything on the coast of Florida, and Tampa and St. Petersburg are going to rebuild everything, and then anybody who wants to live there can come and live there. Well, this is America. In the case of the Palestinian Arabs, Gaza is their home. That's their country. How can you dispose of all of this without any consideration whatsoever for any feelings or interests? So I think this has harmed us. I think it's harmed him. I think it's made us look ridiculous. It makes us look as though we are the willing puppet of this small state called Israel in the Middle East. That's unfortunate. Well, I'm sure, you know, his Jewish friends in New York City and Las Vegas and elsewhere are enthusiastic. No doubt Mr. Netanyahu, grinning like a Cheshire cat, is delighted with the prospect of having the United States permanently embroil itself in the tar pit of the Middle East on behalf of Israel. We need to point out to the listeners and the viewers that this has been walked back. If you go towards the end of the day yesterday when all of this developed, this new woman who is the spokesman in the White House, Mrs. Leavitt, I think is her name.
Yes.
She made it very clear that this was not something that was going to go forward. She was, very politic about it and very diplomatic, but this is dead in the water. But what the Israelis have done now is so horrific that I doubt he's going to get any form of cooperation in the future whatsoever out of Egypt. But in the meantime, for us to step in and say, we'll now pick up Gaza as the 51st state and we'll protect it, put American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on duty there to protect it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is ludicrous. I think the good news is he's figured it out. The bad news is that these impulsive statements are dangerous. And the same thing is going on with the Russians. He's got major issues in the United States to deal with. He's talked about those. He was voted into office on that basis. He knows the border is a disaster. He's talked about it. That's where he should focus. He needs to disengage from these places overseas. What happens in these places is just not important to us. Well, remember when Begin and Sadat negotiated the end of the 73 war, Begin tried to turn Gaza over to Egypt. And Sadat said, absolutely not. They're not part of Egypt. They are not Egyptians. And he wanted desperately to offload his quote unquote Gaza problem onto Egypt. Now, the Egyptians have cooperated to limit the violence and the capabilities of Hamas and others because they have a mutual interest, or at least had, in suppressing Islamism. Genghis Khan, perhaps the greatest of generals, said occupations turn soldiers into jailers. Mongols never occupied anything. They would have put a new group into power once they'd conquered an area, and they would tell them, you collect the tribute, you pay the taxes, we'll provide the security. And there would be a small contingent there to back up the local government. But they did not occupy anything anywhere. They did not set out to change societies, to change culture, to change religion. And Hamas is by no means destroyed any more than Hezbollah is. But he may think that he's bought more time for Israel to renew the fight and go back and finish the job, which is why he wants all of those 2,000-pound bombs and all the other munitions he can get his hands on. There are lots of Israelis who believe that he has systematically destroyed the Palestinian position and any hope of a Palestinian state. That was the goal, one of the goals. The underlying purpose, though, was to drive everybody out of Gaza. Well, that hasn't quite worked. I think he's going to stick with the first one. It's in his interest to do so, gives his forces a break to rest, refit for the next phase. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to rely primarily, once again, on the hundreds of aircraft that he's got, the Air Force, to do serious damage to any number of different enemies. But he's not going to follow through on the rest of it. And I don't think anybody on the other side of these matters, whether they're in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Hezbollah, anywhere else, Syria, no one believes that. We have to understand that our economy is completely financialized. Someone said to me the other day, Doug, we don't have an economy at all. We have a financial system that owns the economy. I think that's a good way to look at it. These gentlemen that you mentioned are part of that development, that structure of power. I'd be surprised if it were not the case. And I read something, and then I watched briefly Alex Kreiner, who is a very fine financial analyst. He's somebody that you should consider bringing on to look at this from a political standpoint. But he pointed out that obviously the government in London is going to fall because the British economy is moribund and the financial system is going to crash. Now, one of the symptoms of this has been the London Metals Exchange, where the Bank of England is suspiciously may not have the gold in its vaults that it's supposed to have. Now, what gold is there is being extracted by investors in the United States. Apparently, they seem to want to get out before there is a quote unquote margin call and the true dimensions of the scam are revealed. At the same time, you have an interest in the United States with people like Mr. Lutnick, who are connected to the City of London banking system, the people over there, to backstop the losses in order to prevent a wholesale collapse of the financial system in London. And it is rumored, and this is where Kreiner comes in, and he knows more about this than I do, but he suggested they're actually talking about using U.S. treasuries in a sense to backstop by essentially putting them up for sale in an exchange in London. But the problem is there's nothing behind it. And I think that's where we're headed in England. No matter how hard people try to rig the system, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about putting treasuries into the pool of assets on which the banks depend for solvency and effectiveness, that's pretty much the end. So you're talking about a system that's doomed. The objection to it would be, I suspect, in the United States from investors, well, when that falls apart and the government goes down and the bank collapses, what happened to our assets? They're gone. Now, this is something we've never done before. At least I can't find any evidence for it. We've always sold. No. This is somebody said to me, well, look, you got a lemonade stand and there's another lemonade stand that's out of lemonade. So you go over to them and you pour some lemonade into them to keep them going. In other words, why should we put ourselves at risk? Because then we'll end up in the same position. It's a very fishy set of circumstances. It's something that most of us never look at because, frankly, that's not where we're focused. But this is something that deserves a lot of attention in the financial markets, and it deserves attention from Americans who care about the United States. I think he's someone who's grown up in New York and expects that the people that surround him will take profits as they can to enrich themselves, and probably doesn't see anything wrong in that. But more important, he may not really understand the fragility of the situation in London. You know, when Truss was removed as prime minister, she came in gangbusters with a plan to do everything that Margaret Thatcher had done. It was made very clear to her, we can't raise taxes, we can't cut taxes. We don't have the funds. We don't have anything that you want to do. And so she lasted for a few months. It was gone. I think that's where Starmer is right now, only his position is far worse. He's talking about shipping billions of pounds to Ukraine, which is absurd since Ukraine is a bottomless pit with nobody in it anymore. But more important, they don't have it to send. And when this Bank of England goes under, there's going to be chaos. And that's going to have an impact on the continent. It's going to have an impact here in the United States. I think we're going to see a ripple effect.
Right.
I think Donald Trump is someone who doesn't want a war. I've said that from the beginning. His instincts tell him wars are not good for presidents. But people can be talked into things, and he is someone who can be talked into things. It's not his forte. He's much more comfortable talking about business and economics and so forth. He's also got all of these donors standing behind him who have poured tens of millions of dollars into his campaign to get him elected. And they, too, want war with Iran. So I think it's a very difficult position that he's in. I wouldn't second guess him at this stage, but I would not exclude the possibility that he falls for the argument. We can do this. We'll do it quickly. It'll be over in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I mean, that's something that General Wes Clark told Bill Clinton when he was president about the Kosovo Air campaign. And President Clinton said, how long do you think this will last? And he said, well, 3 or 4 days, 2 weeks at the most. Very hazardous statement to make. Wars are not predictable things.
Right.
So I think you've got a similar situation here. It depends on how much trust and confidence the president has in either Netanyahu or Lindsey Graham or Mr. Waltz, his national security advisor, who is also an Iran war advocate. So I wouldn't be surprised. I doubt seriously that Mr. Hegseth would push back against this. He's also another Iran war advocate. The worst thing that could happen for Mr. Netanyahu is for President Trump to strike a quote unquote deal with Iran that leaves Iran, in a position to build a nuclear weapon. He doesn't want that. He wants absolute certainty that there's no potential capability for that at all. That may be difficult for President Trump to deliver. And overheard this mentioned, whether or not it was something that President Trump said or someone else, who knows? I would be very careful not to rush to assume that. Now, if, as you say, he emerges from the meeting and announces that, then that would suggest that he's made it clear to Mr. Netanyahu that regardless of what Netanyahu wants, we are going to open a new chapter in our relationship with Iran. I would welcome that, as I'm sure you would, because I certainly don't want to see a war between Iran and Israel or anybody else over there. But I wouldn't bet on it yet. He is, in my judgment, for President Trump's purposes, the voice from hell. And if President Trump continues to invite him into his inner circle, he's making a very serious mistake. But I think that Lindsey Graham and Mr. Netanyahu are unambiguously on the same page. I think they both want that war desperately, and they want us to be in it. And they think that they can be successful early on with the right kinds of strikes. We've heard that sort of thing so many times in the past, going back decades. It doesn't make any difference. Once you open the door to a war like that, it has a bad habit of running in all sorts of directions you never anticipated, which is why I and many others would prefer no war at all, Judge. The notion that you're going to force the Russians into anything at this point, particularly in Ukraine, is absurd. That would be similar to saying, we're going to force the Americans to come to terms with the Mexicans, and you're sitting in Beijing. It's absurd. It's not going to happen. It's ridiculous. We need to stop talking about that. But this is part of the national narcissism, which is almost terminal inside the Beltway. People can't step away from the possibility that our power is not limitless. The other thing is, given the way things are going in the Middle East, you could be in a major regional war in 30 days, and the price for a barrel of oil could go to $90 or $100 a barrel overnight. So I think this is all nonsense about energy. We're not going to threaten the Russians in any way, shape, or form in a way that makes any sense. Look, what have we done for years? I mean, this hostility to Russia, what good has it done? It's been self-defeating. If there's a lesson to be learned from this disastrous Biden administration, is it's all self-defeating. So let's drop all this silly language and nonsense about how great we are and how we can force this or that. It's all trash. Get rid of it. Dump it. So the whole idea, this old paradigm, is dead. We can't repeat any of that. So the answer is no. The Europeans must take the lead. They must take responsibility for their own security. Defense of the Western Hemisphere is critical now. Our country's in a lot of trouble. Our open borders have created chaos here inside the United States. And that's what's most important at all. There's going to be very little that we can do beyond our borders. We're in a position very similar to the British Empire at the turn of the century. The British Empire had a marvelous navy. We have a good navy. We have good air forces. There are places we can go if we need to temporarily, but we cannot become a permanent presence anywhere, because we are ultimately a maritime and aerospace country. We're not a land power anywhere but in the continental United States, which is why I keep arguing you got to get the Army back here, and you got to get the Army back in the business of national defense, which is defense of our borders, defense of the United States. So that's the first answer to the question. The second part of it is, yes, in small numbers, depending upon the situation, we can lend support or assistance to someone. But even then, it's very risky. The British tried to rescue the Greeks who came under attack by the Italians and the Germans. And the great British Navy did all that it could, but it was no match for the German Air Force and the German Army. And it would play out very similarly with the Russians. So I'm afraid we've got to be very careful about promises we make that we can never keep. So we ought to back away, encourage people to do what is in their interest, and consider carefully the limitations of our abilities to support anybody else beyond the Western Hemisphere. First of all, we're going to reinvigorate the energy industry. We're going to drill, baby, drill. Well, first of all, we're a long way behind where we were a few years ago. We are not extracting nearly as much as we did. The shale extraction is not developing dramatically at this point. We haven't built new rigs. We haven't built any new refineries. I could go down the list. The oil industry has had no incentive to invest in anything new, because every time they turned around, Washington hit them over the head with all this environmental business. And of course, that's hurt us as a country, hurt us as a nation. So you're not going to get anywhere very quickly just because you say, I want to drill for oil and I want more oil and I want more gasoline. Forget it. It doesn't work that way. It's not a switch, that you switch on. That's the first part. And I think the second part is very obvious what you've said. If you were to destroy that price, it would hurt us here very, very badly. This is not going to work. This is a dumb idea. This once again assumes that we're the center of the universe and that we can drive prices everywhere. We can't. Our market is not the only market anymore. We've been through this how many times? The Chinese, last year we had $1 trillion trade deficit. Last year they had $1 trillion trade surplus. They have more manufacturing capability and power than the United States and Europe combined. It is China that right now and for the foreseeable future is going to be the economic engine driving everything on this planet. That doesn't mean we're bad or weak or falling behind. For most of the last 2,000 years, China was the largest driving market in the world. It's not a new phenomenon. China simply regained what it had 100, 200, 300 years ago. So we got to stop talking in these foolish terms, because the only people that are impressed with that are the few Americans at home that don't know anything, that are out of touch with reality and like hearing wonderful things about themselves. The rest of the world just looks at us like, how stupid can you be? And they're right. We're being very stupid right now. And frankly, at this point, from an American standpoint, that's fine. The United States doesn't need it. What we need is good relations with everybody in Europe, and we don't need to have to garrison the place to get those. So I think all of this is bound up with what President Trump is thinking. And I'm really glad to hear the things that Secretary Hegseth has said, because they are a breath of fresh air. Well, this is important to understand that whenever I've been critical of President Trump on the question of what to do about Ukraine since he took office, I fully support the president on his domestic policies, and I think they're going in the right direction. He set a lot of positive forces in motion. Strongly support those. My concern has always been not to be distracted by events overseas, that if he could lose control here at home, because there are far more serious crises that are closer to us, and that's where he should focus. Now, having said that, I think we have to understand a couple of things. He came in and he adopted this false narrative that had been spun up over the previous years in London and Langley, and then repeated ad nauseum by the media, that we're all willing servants of this war. He's got to sweep that aside. He's got to get back to basics and go back to something that he did indicate a long time ago. This is not his. He did not start this. He did not want this. He said repeatedly it wouldn't have happened had he been there, fine. But now he needs to make it very clear this is not his, and he wants to end it. Now, he doesn't have to get a quote-unquote win over the Russians. Believe me, if he ends this, he gets a win at home, here, with the American people. They don't want anything to do with this war with Russia, and certainly don't want the risk of any kind of nuclear conflagration. Absolutely not. So that's his win. The Europeans win because they're ultimately going to replace these terrible governments, these globalists that have sacrificed over 1 million Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russians to nothing for no purpose when it was completely unnecessary. They need to go away, and they need to be expelled and removed. Now, as far as whether or not NATO survives, I don't think it will. I think NATO is increasingly an empty facade, and it may be one of these things, well, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It may just quietly sink into the abyss and vanish. It's not meaningful.